Hello, BookTube. This is week 2 of Pentathon, created by the Paperback Junkie, Matt Wall. And this week, the challenge was to read H.P. Lovecraft, um, something I have not done much of ever. So, a bit of a new experience for me. I found my story in Dark Imaginings, a collection of gothic fantasy edited by, let's see here, Robert H. Boyer and Kenneth Zahorsky. This volume is a Delta book, and it came out in 1978. And the story I read was The Haunter of the Dark. And there is an image from there is Federal Hill. So this is a story of one Robert Blake, and he's a painter and a writer, and he writes occult stories. Doesn't get into his paintings much, but I get the impression they were of a similar nature. And it takes place in New England, Providence, Rhode Island, and it is part of Cthulhu mythos. And there's an abandoned church stone on the western side of the city, which in mythology, the west is the land of the dead, especially in Egypt, ancient Egypt. And in the eastern part of the city, Blake has taken up residence. So he feels the pull of this this stone building on a far hill that seems almost misty, almost like a mirage, but it's really there. And eventually he feels the pull so much that he wanders into a strange part of the city, strange to him. And in that area, a large Italian immigrant group has replaced the previous Anglo and the previous Irish occupants of that part of the city. And they have a dread of this building, which we learn later had once been occupied by a sect. I'm trying to think if I can see real quick what the name of this. This group was called the Starry Wisdom. And they weren't very popular with the more orthodox folks around. And there was a long history, and eventually they were driven away. Their founder had been a cultist who had done archaeological work in ancient Egypt. And he had found something they call the Shining Trapezohedron. And it allowed a vision into other worlds. And it was a dark, sinister thing, of course. So it's a very atmospheric story. It involves light and lightning. The creature at the center of the story can't deal with light, and our hero ends up going into this building after he found it, and he finds all sorts of things, and a certain atmosphere is created, or there's an attempt to create it, and all does not go well for anyone who gets near this creature, of course, and I'm not going to say much more about the story. I found the use of language interesting, so I went back afterwards and went to this book, a volume that I purchased after watching Curtis of Curtis Books and Books mention, and I've used this volume many times since, so thank you, Curtis. It's the Cambridge Companion to American Science Fiction, edited by Eric Carl Link and Jerry Canavan, or Canavan, I'm not sure how you'd say it, Cambridge University Press. And this came out originally in 2015. So I looked up a little bit about Lovecraft, and I looked in some of my other reference books, but this is what really stuck in my mind. So we have these groups, these immigrant groups, especially the Italians, that are seen as having brought over their superstitious ways, and yet Lovecraft is saying the superstition he's talking about, he cloaks it a little bit in science, because the beings that are being evoked are from other planets, dark planets, where there's no light. But first, about Lovecraft's writing style, this is what the authors have to say. This is an article by Roger Luckhurst, and it's called American Weird. There is something very wrong with Lovecraft's writing. Infelicitous style, chronic overstatement, and blunt melodramatics are typical of pulp prose. But Lovecraft spectacularly breaks every writing rule. The sentences are choked with clumps of adjective weeds, paragraphs clotted with repetition, and a perversion of the show-don't-tell injunction to read something like show and tell everything repeatedly, reiteratively, redundantly. Despite all this, these mannerisms are fire fitfully to create rather brilliant moments. The weird crawls out of these sentences precisely because of their awkward style. Lovecraft wanted to shake the version of reality created by anthropocentric delusion. To do this required a breaking open of language and genre to get beyond the limits of realism. Lovecraft's horror fiction employs a language that continually stumbles against the trauma of the unrepresentable thing, the shards of a busted pulp sublime falling back into the debris of his sentences. So that's sort of an apologia for some really striking flaws in the style of writing, if you're not into this sort of thing. I don't know if it's apologia or if the flaws are just flaws. So that's difficult for me to ascertain. Did I enjoy the story? Yes, on a level. But I did note that the language seemed odd to me and seemed crude and awkward. So I would have to read more to come to a final decision for myself. But at least this is one critic's take on why he used language the way he did. The other thing I noted was his dealing with ethnicity in this story, the neighborhoods, the history, what seemed to start out as a sort of a Puritan neighborhood with that abhorred devil worship and saw evil behind every door. Seems like it moved into a Victorian type thing, and then an early 20th century thing. Moving ethnic groups, and I had an odd feeling that sort of story was important to Lovecraft. So I was interested to see that there's this little section in Roger Luckhurst's American Weird, where he says that this disgust is motored by Lovecraft's depressingly regurgitated Nordic racism against Asiatic immigration into America in the 1920s, is made evident by one of his first weird tale contributions, The Horror at Red Hook, where there is no sublimation of the explicit belief that horror derives from the chaos of races living in Brooklyn slums around the harbor. The rhythm of the prose is also a hypnotic race-hate mantra. Now, I have not read The Horror at Red Hook, but I do have it. And I don't have an opinion either way because I haven't researched this enough. But I did get an awkward feeling with the story about his handling of the Italian neighborhood. I don't it seems odd with his supernatural horror to have a group that was using whatever resources it had to battle a supernatural horror with their own superstition. It seems odd that that would be juxtaposed the way it was. So the Haunted of the Dark, the Haunter of the Dark, seemed a little problematic, mostly for language. Seemed to have hints of darker parts of Lovecraft's mind. I don't know a whole lot about his biography. It was a good story. I enjoyed it. It's not really what I would seek out myself. So if anybody knows more about his views on these things and his use of language, I'd be interested to hear it. So that's Pentathon, Week 2, H.P. Lovecraft, and thank you, BookTube.